In the dense forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were discovered in 1862 beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church. Local authorities recorded that each skeleton bore signs of systematic torture, fractured limbs that had healed before death, evidence of repeated near-drowning, and strange markings carved into the bones for more than 160 years. Federal records concerning the Church of the Pure Spirit remained sealed, accessible only to those with special clearance. I have obtained documents never before made public that describe how three brothers known as Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft convinced hundreds of devoted followers that suffering was the only path to salvation, and how their dark rituals of purification led to what may be the most disturbing religious cult in American history. The small settlement of Ravenwood in upstate New York was unremarkable in most respects during the early 19th century. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, roughly 40 miles north of Albany, it was home to perhaps 300 residents who earned their living through farming, timber, and trade with nearby communities. The town had been founded in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley in search of fertile land and new opportunities. Like much of upstate New York at the time, Ravenwood found itself at the center of what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening, a period of intense religious revival that swept across America in the early 1800s. The region became known as the Burned-Over District because of the fervor of religious movements that seemed to ignite and spread like wildfire through its communities. It was an era in which new denominations emerged, established faiths were questioned, and charismatic preachers could draw crowds, numbering in the thousands, to outdoor revival meetings. Into this spiritual upheaval came the Ravencroft brothers in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, possessed the commanding presence of a man accustomed to obedience. His deep-set eyes, nearly black in certain light, seemed to peer into the soul when he spoke of divine matters. Deacon Silas, 39, appeared more scholarly, with wire-rimmed spectacles and slender fingers perpetually stained with ink from his constant writing of religious texts. Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35, carried an unsettling quality that many found both compelling and disturbing. He spoke in whispers that somehow carried across crowded rooms, and his pale blue eyes would often roll back during what he claimed were divine visions. The brothers arrived with considerable means, purchasing a large tract of land on the outskirts of town, where they immediately began constructing what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Unlike the simple white clapboard meeting houses common throughout New England and New York, their church was built from dark stone quarried from nearby hills. Its architecture was unusual, a central octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, with a steeple rising to a height that seemed excessive for such a remote location. Most striking was the absence of windows in the main sanctuary, with light provided only by carefully positioned lanterns during services. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra announced at their first gathering, which curiosity made well attended despite initial skepticism from locals. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation. The Spirit has revealed to us that this community shall be the cradle of a new understanding." The brothers' arrival was perfectly timed. The religious landscape of America in 1825 was fractured and uncertain. Traditional denominations, such as the Episcopalians and Presbyterians, were losing ground to more emotional and demonstrative faiths. Methodists were gaining converts through circuit riders who carried fiery sermons to the frontier. Baptists were expanding rapidly with their emphasis on individual conversion experiences, and new American-born faiths were beginning to emerge. The Mormons would begin their journey just a few years later, less than 100 miles away, when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830. In this climate of spiritual searching, the Ravencroft's message found fertile ground. Their doctrine was deceptively simple at first. True salvation could be achieved only through suffering that burned away sin and impurity. They cited biblical passages about refinement through fire and Christ's suffering on the cross. What distinguished their teaching was its literal interpretation. Physical suffering was not symbolic, but necessary for spiritual cleansing. The flesh is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas would explain during early sermons, his voice measured and reasonable. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken can the spirit truly soar. Their congregation grew steadily through that first year. The brothers were selective about who they allowed to join, requiring potential members to undergo a discernment interview with Prophet Caleb, who would decide whether they were worthy vessels for purification. Those accepted came primarily from three groups: the desperately poor, seeking community and purpose; the deeply troubled, seeking redemption from past sins; and the wealthy, seeking spiritual experiences beyond what traditional churches offered. Margaret Wilkins was among the earliest converts, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the previous winter. She had been contemplating ending her life when she encountered Elder Ezra in town. He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts, she later wrote in a journal discovered by federal investigators. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair. By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 100 members. Some lived in simple dwellings built around the church, while others maintained homes in Ravenwood but spent most of their time at the church compound. The Ravencrofts encouraged members to donate their property and savings to the church, explaining that worldly attachments prevented spiritual elevation. The most devoted followers were invited to become vessels of the Spirit, a special status requiring participation in more intensive purification rituals. These early ceremonies were relatively mild compared to what would follow: extended fasting, night-long prayer vigils, and rituals involving ice-cold water meant to symbolize the drowning of the sinful self. What few outsiders realized was how methodically the Ravencrofts were escalating the intensity of these practices. Like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water, their followers were being conditioned to accept increasingly extreme forms of purification without recognizing the dangerous path they were on. By 1829, when construction began on an extensive network of chambers beneath the church, the Ravencrofts had established complete control over their followers' lives, thoughts, and bodies. The stage was set for darkness to descend upon the Church of the Pure Spirit. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a private meeting documented years later, the sheep had been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd. The people of Ravenwood would soon learn that the Ravencroft brothers' definition of a shepherd had little to do with protection and everything to do with sacrifice. The transformation of the Church of the Pure Spirit from an unusual but seemingly benign religious community into something far more sinister can be traced to a specific date: December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice and longest night of the year. What occurred that night would later be referred to in secret church documents as the First Ascension and would establish the pattern for the horrors that followed. The day began with an announcement from Elder Ezra that Prophet Caleb had received a profound vision during the night. The entire congregation was summoned to the church for what was described as a revelation of the next level of purification. As darkness fell and temperatures dropped below freezing, nearly 150 followers filled the windowless sanctuary, illuminated only by 12 large candles placed at points along an enormous pattern carved into the wooden floor spiral, winding inward toward a central platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who had joined the church 6 months earlier after the death of his wife, later escaped and provided testimony about what followed. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra addressed the congregation with unusual intensity, his voice rising to a fevered pitch as he explained that their previous purification rituals had merely been preparation for true cleansing. "Brothers and sisters," Elder Ezra proclaimed, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding, but the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it requires greater courage than we have yet demanded." At that moment, Prophet Caleb emerged from one of the side chambers. Witnesses described him as appearing transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes rolled back to reveal only white. He began to speak in what he claimed was the tongue of angels, a series of guttural sounds and high-pitched wails that echoed through the sanctuary. After several minutes of this disturbing display, Prophet Caleb collapsed to the floor. When he rose again, he spoke in his normal voice, but with a cadence and authority many found mesmerizing. He announced that the Spirit had selected 3 members of the congregation for the honor of the first ascension: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters. He called out, "The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation." The 3 individuals, all relatively recent converts, were led to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed, Hartford said, was a ceremony unlike anything he believed possible among civilized people. Each of the 3 was stripped to their undergarments despite the winter cold. They were then bound to wooden frames constructed in the shape of inverted crosses. Elder Ezra explained to the congregation that inverting the sacred symbol was not blasphemy, but a necessary reversal of fortune, from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to rebirth. For the next several hours, the Ravencroft brothers subjected the 3 chosen ones to a series of torments they called the 7 trials of purification. First came the trial of air, in which wet cloths were placed over their faces while water was slowly poured over them, creating the sensation of drowning. Then came the trial of earth, where soil from the church grounds was packed around their bodies up to their necks, effectively burying them alive for short periods. The trial of fire involved heated metal implements pressed briefly against their skin, leaving burn marks in deliberate patterns. The trial of water saw them repeatedly submerged in ice-cold water until they lost consciousness, then revived. Hartford's testimony becomes fragmented when he describes the final 3 trials, as he admitted to vomiting and nearly fainting during the proceedings. What is clear from multiple accounts is that throughout these tortures, the 3 victims were urged to embrace their suffering as a divine blessing. Whenever they screamed in pain, the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Most disturbing was the congregation's response. Hartford reported that while some members wept quietly or looked away, many appeared entranced, watching with expressions of reverence or ecstasy. The Ravencrofts had spent years conditioning their followers to associate pain with spiritual advancement, and now that conditioning bore its terrible fruit. Near dawn, when the 7 trials were complete, the 3 victims hung limp on their frames, barely conscious, but still alive. Elder Ezra announced that they had been emptied of sin and were now ready to be filled with the pure Spirit. What happened next, Hartford said, would haunt those who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Prophet Caleb approached each victim and placed his hands on their heads, whispering into their ears. According to Hartford and one other witness who later spoke to authorities, the 3 victims suddenly convulsed violently, their bodies arching against their restraints with such force that bones could be heard breaking. Their eyes flew open, bulging and bloodshot. They began speaking in the same strange language Prophet Caleb had demonstrated earlier. By sunrise, all 3 were dead. Elder Ezra proclaimed them successfully ascended and declared that their souls had been so thoroughly purified that they had been accepted directly into heaven, bypassing judgment. Their bodies, he explained, were merely empty vessels now, to be revered as holy relics. The 3 corpses were not buried immediately. Instead, they were placed in one of the newly constructed chambers beneath the church. laid out on stone slabs where congregation members could view them and pray for similar elevation, according to church records later seized by authorities. These were the first of what would eventually become hundreds of bodies stored in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after the first ascension, several congregation members quietly packed their belongings and fled Ravenwood. Thomas Hartford was among them, though he did not speak of what he had witnessed for many years, believing no one would accept that such horrors were possible in Christian America. Those who remained became even more devoted to the Ravencrofts and their twisted doctrine. The brothers had crossed the threshold into murder, disguised as a religious ceremony, and found that their control over their followers was not weakened, but reinforced within the Church of the Pure Spirit. Death had become sacrament, as Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers after the ceremony, in a conversation later recounted by a church elder who eventually turned state's evidence. Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away. There is nothing they will not accept from us now. He was right. The first ascension was only the beginning of the atrocities at the Church of the Pure Spirit. What followed would be 3 decades of escalating horror, hidden behind the respectable facade of religious devotion. In the years after the first ascension, the Church of the Pure Spirit changed in ways the outside world largely failed to notice. From 1830 to 1845, the Ravencroft brothers refined their methods and expanded their influence, developing both their theological justifications and their practical techniques for what they called elevations. But what were, in reality, ritualized killings? They were careful to maintain a veneer of respectability. The public face of their church emphasized charity, community, and spiritual renewal themes that fit perfectly with the ongoing religious revival sweeping through the burned-over district. Outwardly, they participated in the broader religious community, occasionally hosting gatherings where other preachers were invited to speak and making donations to causes such as temperance societies and orphanages. Behind this facade, however, the true nature of their operations grew increasingly complex and disturbing. The underground chambers, initially built as simple cellars, were expanded into an elaborate network of tunnels and rooms that extended far beyond the church's footprint. Local workers hired for the early construction were replaced by devoted church members who could be trusted with secrets, and eventually excavation was performed exclusively by vessels of the Spirit followers who had proven absolute loyalty. By 1835, the catacombs, as they came to be known among the inner circle, contained at least 7 large chambers and dozens of smaller alcoves, each serving a specific function in the Ravencroft's twisted theology. The Chamber of Preparation, where candidates for elevation were kept in isolation for days before their ordeal. The Chamber of Trials, where the 7 purification tortures were administered. The Chamber of Ascension, where the final fatal rituals took place. And most disturbing of all, the Chamber of Saints, where the bodies of the ascended were preserved. This preservation of corpses became a central element of the cult's practices. Unlike most religious groups that reverently bury their dead, the Ravencrofts kept their victims' bodies in various states of preservation. Some were partially mummified using techniques Deacon Silas had allegedly learned from medical texts. Others were reduced to clean skeletons through methods investigators would later struggle to reconstruct. These remains were arranged in elaborate tableaux throughout the Chamber of Saints, posed in positions of prayer or ecstasy, sometimes articulated with wire to hold their posture. Elizabeth Carver, who joined the church in 1832 and escaped in 1844, provided some of the most detailed descriptions of these chambers. "The smell was the first thing that struck you," she told federal investigators. Not the stench of decay one might expect, but an overwhelming odor of chemicals. Turpentine, alcohol, and something sweeter she could not identify. The brothers claimed it was the perfume of sanctity, but she later learned it was substances used in embalming. Carver described how new members were gradually introduced to the existence of the chamber's first hearing of them as symbolic spaces, then being permitted limited access to the less disturbing areas, and finally, for those deemed most loyal, being allowed to witness or even participate in the rituals conducted within them. It was, she explained, a careful seduction. By the time you saw the chamber of saints, with its dozens of corpses arranged like some grotesque congregation, you had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that it seemed beautiful rather than horrifying. I remember weeping with what I thought was religious ecstasy the first time I was permitted entry, she said. Now, those tears shame me beyond words. The frequency of elevations increased gradually. In 1830, according to church records later seized as evidence, there were only 2 such ceremonies, resulting in 5 deaths. By 1835, the number had risen to quarterly events, each claiming 2 to 4 lives. By 1840, monthly elevations had become the norm, with special ceremonies on solstices and equinoxes that often took larger numbers of victims. The Ravencrofts also became more deliberate in choosing candidates for elevation. At first, they favored those with few close family connections, orphans and drifters who would not be missed. Later, as their confidence grew, they began selecting from devoted families within the congregation, framing selection as the highest honor a family could receive. To give a child to the Spirit was presented as the ultimate expression of faith. Carver recalled, parents would compete for this blessing, offering their sons and daughters with a fervor that seems unimaginable to me now. While the brothers maintained their distinct roles, Elder Ezra as the authoritative voice, Deacon Silas as the scholarly theologian, and Prophet Caleb as the mystical conduit to the divine, their private dynamic shifted over time. According to accounts from former members of the inner circle, Caleb's influence grew as his visions began directing more and more aspects of church life. By 1840, it was Caleb who selected all candidates for elevation. Evidence of asphyxiation combined with extreme physical stress. In 1850, Garrett quietly contacted Thornhill, Coate, providing detailed medical reports on 7 bodies he had examined. These documents offered the first scientific evidence that something deeply sinister was occurring at the Church of the Pure Spirit. Even so, authorities remained hesitant to act against a religious organization without incontrovertible proof of criminal wrongdoing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1851, Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, Phelps' mental condition, long in decline, reached a critical breaking point. According to later testimony from church members, he began experiencing violent episodes, ranting about spirits emerging from the walls and claiming the divine anatomy was becoming visible in the air. During services, his prophetic utterances grew increasingly erratic and terrifying, unsettling even the most devoted followers. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas attempted to manage the situation by restricting Prophet Caleb's public appearances, explaining his absence as periods of intense communion with the Spirit. In private, however, they confined him to a specially constructed room deep within the underground chambers, where his screams could not be heard above ground. This confinement might have contained the problem had Prophet Caleb not escaped during a brief lapse in supervision. On the night of June 17, 1851, he somehow freed himself from his restraints and fled through the catacombs, merging into the woods beyond the church grounds. What followed was described by the Albany Evening Journal as a scene of public madness unprecedented in the region's history. Naked and covered in self-inflicted wounds, Prophet Caleb appeared in Ravenwood's town square during a community gathering celebrating the summer planting. Before a horrified crowd, he proclaimed himself the living vessel of the pure Spirit and began describing, in explicit detail, the rituals conducted beneath the church. The blood of the purified strengthens our connection to the divine, he reportedly shouted. 27 vessels have been emptied, and the Spirit has filled me with their essence. The chambers below hold the sacred remains of the elevated, and soon all of you shall join them in glorious suffering. Local authorities detained Prophet Caleb, initially believing him to be a dangerous lunatic. When he identified himself as one of the Ravencroft brothers, however, his ravings took on a far more ominous significance. Thornhill, who had cultivated relationships with several local officials, was notified immediately and arrived in Ravenwood the following day to interview him. What Thornhill encountered was a man in the final stages of psychological collapse. Prophet Caleb alternated between catatonic silence and frenzied confession, providing details about the church's activities that corroborated earlier testimony from escaped members. Most crucially, he drew detailed maps of the underground chambers, including hidden entrances and the location of the Chamber of Saints where victims' remains were stored. Armed with this new evidence and Prophet Caleb's first-hand testimony, Thornhill finally secured authorization for an official investigation. But word of Caleb's detention and questioning reached Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas before authorities could organize a full search of the church grounds. What followed revealed the brothers' ruthless efficiency in crisis management. Within hours of learning of Caleb's detention, they activated a contingency plan later identified in church records as the cleansing flame. Members of the inner circle were dispatched to remove the most incriminating evidence from the underground chambers, particularly financial records and the bodies of the most recent victims. Then, in an act combining desperation with calculated precision, they orchestrated a controlled fire in the main church building. The blaze was carefully set to destroy specific areas while leaving others intact, creating the appearance of a tragic accident rather than deliberate destruction of evidence. When authorities arrived with a search warrant on June 19, 1851, they found the church partially burned and the congregation engaged in recovery efforts. Elder Ezra greeted investigators with apparent cooperation, expressing shock at his brother's mental collapse and offering full access to the property. "It seems God has tested us doubly," he reportedly told officials. "First with the affliction of my beloved brother's mind, and now with this terrible fire. But we shall rebuild, as faith must always rise from ashes." The investigation that followed was hindered not only by fire damage, but by the brothers' meticulous preparations. The entrance to the main tunnel system had collapsed during the blaze, complicating access. When excavation finally exposed the underground chambers, investigators found them partially flooded due to water deliberately diverted from a nearby stream. Many rooms had been emptied, showing signs of hurried removal. Despite this, enough evidence remained to confirm the most disturbing elements of Prophet Caleb's confession. In chambers that escaped both fire and flooding, investigators discovered specialized restraints, torture-modified tools, and chemical compounds used in embalming. Most damning was the Chamber of Saints, where, despite efforts to clear it, dozens of human remains were found in various states of preservation. "The scene defies adequate description," wrote federal investigator Daniel Blackwood in his official report. Skeletal remains were arranged in poses of supplication, partially preserved corpses seated as though attending a macabre congregation, and, most horrifying of all, small chambers containing the remains of children posed as if at play, bearing unmistakable signs of violent death. The discovery stunned even hardened investigators. Newspaper accounts, heavily censored to suit Victorian sensibilities, nonetheless conveyed enough detail to provoke widespread horror. The Albany Evening Journal headline of June 25, 1851, reads simply, "House of Worship Revealed as Charnel House. Brothers accused of unspeakable acts in the name of religion." Authorities worked to identify the remains and determine the full scope of the crimes. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas maintained their innocence. They claimed Prophet Caleb had acted independently, without their knowledge or consent, and expressed shock at the revelations. This defense might have carried weight had it not been for one final devastating discovery. In a hidden compartment beneath Deacon Silas's private quarters, investigators found a leather-bound ledger documenting every elevation from 1829 to 1851, written in Silas's distinctive hand. The book listed names, dates, methods used, and detailed notes on the disposal of remains, including those sold to medical institutions. Most incriminating were entries explicitly assigning direction and participation to all three brothers, specific references to Elder Ezra's role in selecting candidates. This ledger, combined with testimony from former members and Prophet Caleb's confession, provided overwhelming proof of guilt. On July 3, 1851, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft were arrested on multiple charges, including murder, fraud, and desecration of human remains. The case would become one of the most sensational trials of the mid-19th century. Although much of the most disturbing evidence was withheld from public view to protect public morality and religious sensibilities, the investigation continued to uncover new horrors, extending beyond the church itself to the brothers' earlier activities and the full reach of their operations. Even as legal proceedings advanced, many of the darkest secrets of the Church of the Pure Spirit remained buried, awaiting discovery by those who would continue the investigation long after the Ravencroft brothers faced justice. As the inquiry deepened through the summer of 1851, authorities came to realize they were confronting not merely a cult with aberrant beliefs, but a vast criminal enterprise whose influence extended into religious, medical, and financial institutions across American society. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas remained in custody, awaiting trial, while Prophet Caleb was committed to the state lunatic asylum in Utica, deemed too mentally unstable to stand trial. Their followers scattered in the aftermath, some fleeing to avoid prosecution, others remaining in Ravenwood in shock and disbelief, their entire worldview shattered by the revelations. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, appointed to lead the case, established a temporary office in Ravenwood to coordinate the expanding investigation. As he assembled evidence from church records, witness testimony, and forensic examinations, a disturbing timeline emerged, one that extended back even before the brothers' arrival in upstate New York. The Ravencrofts did not begin their crimes in Ravenwood, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report to his superiors in Washington. Evidence suggests similar activities in at least 3 prior locations, dating back to 1817. In each instance, the brothers had established a religious community, gathered vulnerable followers, and departed before authorities grew suspicious. What distinguished Ravenwood, Blackwood noted, was not the nature of the crimes, but their duration and scale. Records recovered from a hidden vault beneath Deacon Silas's quarters revealed that the brothers had operated under different names in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Ohio before settling in New York. In each location, they refined their methods, learned from past mistakes, and developed the theological framework that would ultimately become the doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting the brothers had not acted alone. Correspondence between Deacon Silas and individuals at several medical colleges indicated knowledge of, not explicit awareness of, the illicit origin of the specimens being supplied. One letter from a prominent Philadelphia anatomist, dated 1844, praised the exceptional quality and unique preparation of bodies received from the church, noting that the subjects showed evidence of systematic anatomical study prior to death, as though the bodies were prepared for our work while still living. This revelation opened a new and horrifying dimension to the case. The Ravencrofts had not merely been killing their followers in the name of religious purification. They had been conducting systematic experiments on living subjects, documenting the results, and selling both the bodies and their research to medical institutions. The brothers appeared to have been engaged in a crude but deliberate form of physiological research. Dr. Samuel Prescott of Albany Medical College stated in his expert testimony that the patterns of injury, the methods of tissue preservation, and the detailed anatomical notes suggest an attempt to study human responses to various stimuli, particularly pain and its effects on the body's systems. In August 1851, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a respected Boston physician came forward with information that transformed the understanding of the case. Dr. Jonathan Crane testified that while studying at Harvard Medical School in the early 1820s, he had encountered a visiting lecturer named Simon Ravenwood, who presented controversial theories about pain response and religious ecstasy. "I remember being disturbed by his methods and conclusions," Crane testified. He described experiments that seemed unethical even by the standards of the time and spoke of pain as a gateway to transcendent experience. "I dismissed him as a medical eccentric, but when I saw the newspaper accounts of the Ravencroft case, I recognized not only the theories, but the man himself from the published sketches." Simon Ravenwood and Silas Ravencroft are undoubtedly the same person. This connection suggested that the religious doctrine of the Church of the Pure Spirit had not simply been a means of controlling followers or justifying murder. Instead, the belief system had been deliberately constructed to facilitate systematic human experimentation, sanctifying acts that served the brothers' research. Following this lead, investigators discovered a hidden room beneath Deacon Silas's quarters, containing hundreds of notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings, experimental protocols, and observations. The journals documented a grotesque research program spanning decades, with entries growing increasingly scientific and less religious in tone over time. Subject 157 maintained consciousness for 47 minutes after removal of read one particularly disturbing entry from 1848, partially redacted. Heart continued functioning for 12 minutes beyond loss of consciousness. Vocalization patterns consistent with previous trials. Blood loss measured at approximately 1.7 liters. Results support hypotheses regarding sustainability of vital functions under extreme conditions. When this evidence was presented to Elder Ezra during interrogation, his facade of religious devotion finally collapsed. According to interview transcripts, he laughed for nearly a full minute before responding. "You understand nothing," he told Blackwood. "The Spirit has many names. Some call it God, others call it science. We merely sought knowledge, others were too weak to pursue. The elevation of our followers was real. They contributed to understanding that will benefit mankind for generations. Their suffering had purpose. Their deaths had meaning." The revelation of the brothers' true motives sent shockwaves through the medical establishment. Several prominent physicians in medical schools that had received specimens or research connected to the Ravencrofts came under scrutiny, forcing a broader reckoning with ethical standards in medical research and education. As autumn approached, investigators continued the grim task of excavating the church grounds. Initial estimates of victims had relied on Prophet Caleb's claim of 217 vessels, but as the excavation progressed, it became clear that the true number was far higher. "We have identified remains of at least 276 individuals thus far," Blackwood reported in September, based on soil analysis and the expansion of the underground chambers. "We believe additional remains may be located beneath adjacent properties." The brothers appear to have tunneled outward as their operation expanded. Investigation grew even more complex with the discovery of correspondence, suggesting that not all victims had been willing church members. Letters between Elder Ezra and various associates in nearby towns outlined a system for identifying and acquiring suitable subjects, primarily travelers, immigrants, and others unlikely to be immediately missed. One note reads simply, "The red-haired Irishman who passed through last Thursday would make an excellent vessel." One such letter, written by a church member in a neighboring community, read, "No family, seeking work, strong constitution. I have directed him to Ravenwood with a promise of employment at the mill. Expect his arrival by Saturday next." This evidence transformed the understanding of the case from one of religious extremism, preying on willing followers, into something closer to organized abduction and murder carried out for both profit and pseudoscientific research. The implications were disturbing, not only because of the scale of the brothers' crimes, but also because they suggested the existence of a wider network of complicity. Just when it seemed the full horror of Ravenwood had been revealed, the situation grew even darker. The breakthrough that would ultimately expose the full scope of the Ravencroft's operation came in October 1851, when investigators located Samuel Parsons, the church's former accountant, from 1835 to 1849, before being replaced by a newer member. Parsons had lived under an assumed name in Western Massachusetts after fleeing the church upon discovering the true purpose of certain financial transactions. "I believed I was managing donations in legitimate business interests," Parsons testified after being granted immunity, "when I discovered entries for specimen preparation and research grants that coincided with disappearances among the Y congregation. I began keeping private records. When Elder Ezra discovered my separate ledger, scheduled for a special prayer counseling a term I had learned meant selection for elevation, I fled that night with only the clothes on my back." Parsons provided investigators with detailed financial information from memory, including the names of medical institutions that had paid for bodies and research, wealthy patrons who had funded the brothers' work believing it to be legitimate scientific inquiry, and church members who had assisted in various aspects of the operation. Most significantly, Parsons revealed the existence of a second facility located nearly 40 miles from Ravenwood, a remote farmhouse the brothers had purchased through an intermediary in 1840. According to Parsons, this site was used for special research, kept secret even from the church's inner circle. Elder Ezra called it the garden, Parsons recalled. Only he, Deacon Silas, and 2 trusted assistants ever went there. Supplies were delivered, monthly medical equipment, chemicals, specialized restraints. Occasionally selected subjects were transported there, always at night. None ever returned when authorities located and searched the farmhouse. What they discovered surpassed even the horrors found beneath the church. The building had been converted into a sophisticated research facility, with the rooms designed for different types of experiments. Detailed records showed the site had been used primarily for long-term studies, with subjects kept alive for weeks or months while procedures were performed and documented. Most disturbing was evidence that the brothers had focused particular attention on the effects of their purification techniques on children. A separate structure on the property contained small cells and equipment sized for juvenile subjects. Records indicated that at least 37 children, ranging in age from 4 to 16, had been held at the facility between 1840 and 1851. This discovery ignited public outrage unlike anything seen before. Newspapers that had previously exercised restraint now published graphic details, with the New York Tribune running the headline, "Monsters in Human Form. Ravencroft Brothers, Crimes Against Innocence Revealed." Public demonstrations demanded swift justice, and political pressure mounted for an exemplary prosecution. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas, who had maintained outward composure during earlier stages of the investigation, reportedly began to fracture under the weight of the evidence. Prison guards observed Elder Ezra speaking to unseen presences in his cell, while Deacon Silas attempted suicide after being confronted with documentation from the garden as 1851 drew to a close. The case against the Ravencroft brothers had grown from a local atrocity into a national sensation. The upcoming trial promised to be one of the most significant criminal proceedings in American history, with implications not only for the defendants, but for religious freedom, medical ethics, and a dark potential hidden behind respectable facades. Yet, even as preparations for trial moved forward, investigator Blackwood remained troubled by unresolved questions. The brothers' activities had spanned too many years in locations to have gone entirely unnoticed. Their connections to medical institutions and wealthy patrons suggested a level of protection that seemed implausible without some degree of official complicity. And the sophistication of their operation implied resources beyond what church donations alone could provide. I am increasingly convinced that we have uncovered only the visible portion of something far more extensive. Blackwood wrote in his personal journal in December 1851, "The Ravencrofts are undoubtedly guilty of unconscionable crimes, but I cannot escape the suspicion that they were part of a larger enterprise, one that may continue to operate despite their apprehension. The question that haunts me is not whether justice will be served, but whether the full truth will ever come to light." His concerns would prove prophetic in ways he could not yet anticipate, as the trial of the century prepared to begin in Albany in January 1852. The trial of Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft opened on January 12, 1852, in Albany, New York, amid unprecedented security and public interest. The courthouse was surrounded daily by crowds numbering in the thousands, some traveling from as far as Boston and Philadelphia to witness what newspapers called the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented a methodical case over 6 weeks, with more than 100 witnesses testifying about different aspects of the Ravencrofts' crimes. Survivors of the church described the psychological manipulation and gradual doctrination that led them to accept increasingly extreme purification rituals. Medical experts detailed their examinations of recovered remains, confirming patterns of systematic torture and experimentation. Financial records demonstrated the brothers' profits from the sale of bodies and research. The most powerful testimony came from the families of victims, who recounted their loved ones' gradual transformation under the brothers' influence, ending in disappearance or reported death under suspicious circumstances. Sarah Wilkinson's daughter Emma joined the church in 1847 at age 16 and ascended 6 months later. Described receiving letters written in her daughter's hand that grew increasingly strange before stopping altogether. The final letter said she had been selected for a special blessing and that I should rejoice in her coming elevation. Wilkinson testified, "When I traveled to Ravenwood to see her, Elder Ezra told me she had been taken to a retreat for spiritual preparation and could not receive visitors. 3 weeks later, he informed me she had ascended to the pure spirit during a sacred ceremony. I was not permitted to see her body, which he claimed had been sanctified and could not leave church grounds." Throughout the proceedings, the defendant's behavior diverged sharply. Deacon Silas appeared withdrawn, rarely making eye contact and speaking only in whispers to his attorneys. Elder Ezra, by contrast, maintained an unsettling composure, often smiling during the most damning testimony and occasionally nodding as if in approval of the descriptions of his crimes. When the defense finally presented its case in late February, his strategy became clear. The attorneys did not deny the deaths or even many of the practices described. Instead, they argued that the activities of the Church of the Pure Spirit were protected expressions of religious belief, and that participants had acted voluntarily. The Constitution of these United States, the defense declared, guarantees freedom of religious practice. Defense attorney William Hargrove argued that the ceremonies of the Church of the Pure Spirit, however shocking to conventional sensibilities, had been conducted with the full knowledge and consent of participants who shared the Ravencroft's belief in purification through suffering. That argument unraveled under cross-examination, as former church members testified to coercion, deception, and the administration of substances later identified as opium and other mind-altering compounds. The final blow came when prosecutors introduced the records from the garden, which made clear that many victims had been abducted outright rather than recruited as church members. On March 2, 1852, with the trial moving toward its inevitable conclusion, Elder Ezra made a request that altered the proceedings. Against the strong advice of his attorneys, he asked to testify in his own defense. After considerable deliberation, the judge allowed it. What followed became one of the most chilling testimonies ever heard in an American courtroom. For nearly 4 hours, Elder Ezra spoke without notes, delivering what amounted to a sermon on his beliefs and practices. He neither denied the charges nor expressed remorse. Instead, he presented a coherent, terrifying philosophy that fused religious mysticism with scientific rationalism in service of what he called the elevation of humanity through systematic understanding of transcendence. Death comes to all, he told the stunned courtroom. We merely gave it purpose. Those who ascended through our ministrations contributed to knowledge that will ultimately benefit all mankind. Their suffering was temporary, their contribution eternal. Most disturbing was not only the content of his words, but his obvious intellectual clarity and the methodical way he had constructed a belief system to justify atrocity. He spoke of pain as the purest form of consciousness, of death as a mere transition of energy, and of his victims as willing participants in the greatest scientific and spiritual endeavor of the age. When prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children found at the garden, Elder Ezra's response drew audible gasps across the courtroom. The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely, he said. Their observations were most valuable precisely because they were unclouded by preconception. We honored them by allowing their suffering to illuminate paths others fear to tread. That a man in the gallery later identified as Harold Winters, whose son had vanished after attending a church service in 1847, rushed the witness stand with a concealed knife. Court officers restrained him before he reached Elder Ezra, who neither flinched nor attempted to move. You see, Elder Ezra remarked calmly after Winters was removed, even now, the mere suggestion of truth provokes violence from those too limited to comprehend it. This has always been the response to those who push beyond conventional boundaries of knowledge and belief. After Ezra's testimony, Deacon Silas declined to take the stand. His attorney offered only a brief statement, suggesting his client had been under his brother's influence and requesting mercy on that basis. In closing, the prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the brothers' crimes, the suffering of their victims, and the betrayal of both religious faith and scientific principle their actions represented. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both defendants. On March 10, 1852, Judge William Blackwood sentenced the Ravencroft brothers to death by hanging, declaring their crimes an offense against God, humanity, and the moral foundation on which civilized society rests. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but events took an unexpected turn in the weeks that followed. Prophet Caleb, confined at the Utica Asylum, died under mysterious circumstances on March 20th. Official reports claimed nervous exhaustion, though rumors suggested suicide or murder by attendants who had learned of his role in a notorious case. More significantly, on the night of April 7th, a fire broke out in the Albany jail where Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas were being held. By the time it was controlled, 3 inmates and 2 guards had died from smoke inhalation. Initial reports claimed Deacon Silas was among the dead, identified by distinctive rings he wore. Elder Ezra, however, was not found among either the bodies or the survivors. The manhunt that followed became the largest in New York State history up to that time. Federal authorities joined local law enforcement, distributing wanted posters across the Northeast. Sightings were reported as far away as Chicago and Montreal, but none led to capture. As weeks passed without success, troubling questions arose about the jail, fire, and Silas's death. The identification had been made hastily, based more on personal effects than on clear recognition of the severely burned body. Some investigators, including Blackwood, questioned whether either brother had truly died in the blaze. The timing and nature of the incident suggest planning and outside assistance, Blackwood wrote in a confidential report. The possibility must be considered that both brothers escaped, with one corpse misidentified as Deacon Silas, while another prisoner remains unaccounted for amid the confusion. Suspicion gained weight when investigators discovered that a substantial sum, nearly $30,000, had been withdrawn from a bank account linked to the church just 2 days before the fire by an individual matching the description of Jacob Thornton, one of the brothers' most devoted followers who had vanished after their arrest. The most disturbing development came June 1852, when a physician in Baltimore was found murdered in his home under bizarre circumstances. Dr. Edward Mitchell had been one of the medical professionals implicated in receiving specimens from the Church of the Pure Spirit. Though he had cooperated with authorities and avoided prosecution, his body was discovered positioned in the same manner as the elevated victims from the church, with a note pinned to his chest that read simply, "The Spirit sees all who betray its work of the killing," followed by similar murders of 2 other physicians connected to the case over the next year, suggested that the brothers or their remaining followers were systematically eliminating those who had aided the investigation. Each victim was arranged in the same ritual posture, each marked with a similar note, sending a wave of fear through everyone who had been involved. By 1854, the active investigation had been scaled back, with Elder Ezra presumed to have fled the country. Occasional reports surfaced of religious groups with practices resembling the Church of the Pure Spirit, appearing briefly in places as distant as New Orleans, St. Louis, and San Francisco, but none led to the recapture of the infamous preacher, Blackwood, reassigned to other cases but continuing his own private inquiries, became convinced that Elder Ezra had not merely escaped, but had rebuilt his operation somewhere new, likely aided by a network of followers far larger than authorities had initially believed. The Ravencroft case represents not the end of a criminal enterprise, but merely its exposure. He wrote in his final report before retiring in 1860, "The combination of religious fervor, scientific curiosity without moral constraint, and the promise of transcendent knowledge creates an allure that did not die with our prosecution of 2 of its practitioners. I fear we have only driven this darkness deeper into the shadows, where it continues its work beyond our sight." His assessment would prove prophetic. In the decades that followed, scattered reports emerged of religious groups bearing striking similarities to the Church of the Pure Spirit, appearing briefly, then disappearing again, often leaving unexplained vanishings in their wake. None were definitively linked to Elder Ezra Ravencroft, yet the pattern suggested his influence endured. The most significant incident occurred in 1862, a decade after the original case, when a small church calling itself the Sanctuary of Divine Understanding was found abandoned near the Massachusetts-Vermont border. Local authorities, responding to reports of strange lights and noises, discovered an empty building with a hidden cellar containing evidence of recent ritual activity consistent with Ravencroft practices. Most disturbing was a journal recovered from the site. Handwriting experts later confirmed it matched Elder Ezra's known script. The final entry, dated 3 days before the discovery, read, "The work continues as it must. Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the final revelation closer. 100 years from now, when the full truth emerges, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age of understanding. The Spirit is patient, so too must be its servants." Whether this was Elder Ezra's final testament or merely another disappearance before resurfacing elsewhere remains unknown. No confirmed sighting was ever recorded after the Albany jail fire, leaving his ultimate fate one of the great unsolved mysteries of American criminal history. The federal investigation into the Church of the Pure Spirit and the Ravencroft brothers formally concluded in 1862 with the discovery of the abandoned Sanctuary of Divine Understanding and the journal, attributed to Elder Ezra. Federal authorities, stretched thin by the demands of the Civil War, classified the case as resolved despite the lack of certainty regarding Ezra's fate. Physical evidence from Ravenwood and subsequent sites linked to the brothers was consolidated into a special archive within the Department of Justice, accessible only to officials with specific authorization. This collection journals, ritual implements, financial records, and anatomical drawings. Those who had lost family members to the brothers. Elevations formed a support society that eventually expanded to include survivors of similar experiences elsewhere. The group, first called the Assembly of Reconciliation, and later known simply as the Assembly, dedicated itself to identifying and exposing religious practices that crossed the line into exploitation or abuse. The most profound and lasting impact of the Ravencroft case, however, emerged in the field of medical ethics. The revelation that respected medical institutions had knowingly or unknowingly benefited from the brothers' crimes prompted the first serious national conversation about the sourcing of cadavers for medical education and the ethical boundaries of research. In 1855, the American Medical Association adopted its first formal code of ethics regarding anatomical specimens, requiring documentation of legal acquisition for all bodies used in teaching or research. This was followed in 1858 by legislation in several states establishing stricter regulation of medical schools and anatomical research facilities. Dr. William Harrison, who had been instrumental in bringing the Ravencroft's connections to medical institutions to light, became a leading advocate for ethical reform. His 1860 treatise on the moral imperative in scientific inquiry directly addressed the Ravencroft case, arguing that knowledge obtained through cruelty is corrupted at its source, and that science, divorced from humanity's moral compass, inevitably leads to atrocity disguised as progress. The brothers' fusion of religious doctrine and pseudo-scientific research had exposed vulnerabilities at the intersection of faith, science, and authority vulnerabilities. American society would continue to confront long after the specific details of their crimes faded from public memory. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, rumors persisted that Elder Ezra had survived and continued his work. Alleged sightings placed him everywhere from California gold camps to New Orleans, spiritual societies to European medical conferences. None were confirmed. But the persistence of these reports reflected the deep imprint his particular brand of charismatic malevolence had left on the American consciousness. More tangible was evidence of the brothers' continuing influence through followers who escaped prosecution. Between 1865 and 1890, authorities identified at least 7 small religious groups across the country that incorporated elements of the Church of the Pure Spirit's doctrines and practices. None reached the original scale or extremity, but their existence suggested the brothers' ideas had taken root beyond their direct control. The most significant of these groups was uncovered in rural Missouri in 1879, where a charismatic preacher, calling himself Brother Elijah, established a small community centered on transcendence through tribulation. When local authorities investigated reports of troubling activities, they found ritual implements and journals explicitly referencing Ravencroft teachings. Brother Elijah, later identified as Thomas Whitfield, former Inner Circle member of the Church of the Pure Spirit, took his own life rather than face arrest. The final confirmed chapter of the Ravencroft saga came in 1899, when a collection of papers was anonymously donated to the Harvard Medical School library. The materials, contained in a locked iron box, included extensive journals, anatomical drawings, and experimental notes spanning from 1852 to 1898. Handwriting analysis concluded that the most recent entries were in Elder Ezra's hand, though they showed signs of advanced age. The final entry, dated December 31st, 1898, read, "As the century draws to its close, so too does my work in this vessel. Age has finally accomplished what the law could not. I go now to join the pure spirit, content in knowing that the seeds we planted have taken root and will flower in ways we could only imagine. The next generation of seekers will build upon our foundation, finding new methods for the great work of transcendence. The suffering was necessary. The knowledge remains. The spirit continues." Whether this was Elder Ezra's true final testament or an elaborate hoax was never definitively proven. If authentic, it would suggest he survived to the age of 115 in unlikely, though not impossible, longevity. More significant than the question of authorship was the fact that the journals contained detailed experimental protocols and observations that appeared to have influenced certain legitimate medical research in the early 20th century, suggesting that elements of the brothers' work may have infiltrated mainstream science despite its horrific origins. Harvard officials, recognizing the nature of the materials, immediately sealed them from public access. In 1902, after consultation with federal authorities, the collection was transferred to a secured government archive, where it remained classified until 1972, when limited access was granted to scholars studying the history of medical ethics. The site of the original Church of the Pure Spirit in Ravenwood remained vacant until 1923, when the state of New York designated it a restricted area, fenced the property, and posted warnings against trespassing. Local legends claimed the ground was cursed, with stories of strange lights, unexplained sounds, and an overwhelming sense of dread reported by those who ventured too close to the perimeter. In 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted the first archaeological survey of the site, using then modern techniques to examine areas that had been inaccessible during the original investigation. Their findings included additional human remains in previously inexcavated portions of the tunnel system, raising the estimated victim count to more than 200, far above the 276 recorded in the official record. Most disturbing was the discovery of a sealed chamber containing remarkably well-preserved documents that appeared to outline plans for expansion beyond Ravenwood. These materials suggested the Church of the Pure Spirit was intended as only the first node in a network of similar operations across the United States and potentially a broader vision. Elder Ezra may have continued pursuing after his escape. Today, more than 160 years after the Ravencroft's reign of terror was exposed, their legacy persists in multiple domains. In religious studies, they remain an extreme example of how charismatic leadership, incremental normalization of deviant behavior, and the human hunger for transcendent meaning can combine to enable atrocity. In medical ethics, the case continues to be cited as a foundational example of why scientific inquiry requires moral boundaries. In criminal psychology, they stand as early examples of organized, systematic killers who operated under the protection of respected institutions for the communities and families touched by their crimes. However, a craft remains something more immediate and personal. A wound in the fabric of American history that has never fully healed. Descendants of victims and survivors still gather annually in a small ceremony at a memorial established in Albany in 1902, bearing the simple inscription, "For those lost to darkness, that their suffering not be forgotten." The questions that haunted investigator Blackwood in 1852 still echo today. How did the brothers develop their fusion of religious control and pseudoscientific experimentation? Who else knew or helped facilitate their work? And, most disturbingly, how much of their influence persists unrecognized in institutions and ideas that continue to shape American society? The true horror of the Ravencroft case lies not only in the brothers' grotesque acts, but in the recognition that their story represents not an aberration, but a dark possibility inherent in the human capacity for both reverence and cruelty. Their legacy stands as a warning about what happens when charisma, authority, and ideology combine to override our most basic moral constraints. In the dense forests of upstate New York, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood remains empty. The earth still scarred by foundations that time has never fully erased. Local residents say that even now, on particularly still nights, the area is marked by an unnatural silence as though something in that soil continues to absorb sound, light, and warmth, hungry for the suffering that once fed it. This story shows how thin the veneer of civilization can be when authority figures twist faith and science to serve their darkest impulses. What do you think? Do you believe everything was ever truly revealed? Leave a comment below. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next one. All